Once again, I would like to say that we are taking a walk through a series of presentations that I did in 2010 for a Bible school in another country, and I've never done this presentation here. However, if you work like me, you would know that you don't leave behind everything you've ever done for the benefit of something that is new. You incorporate some things that were already done. So from time to time, you'll see a slide or a series of slides that you may have seen in another presentation. But that in no way means that you've heard everything that we're talking about this summer, because all this is a much more in-depth look at the aspects of prophecy that pertain to the wonders of Daniel at the end of Daniel. And in that in-depth look, what we're doing this summer is something you can't do in a presentation. You can't take time to look at the chapter and read the verses, get the flavor of the context, and therefore get the substance of the prophecy that otherwise you refer to very quickly. So here's an analogy of what I'm talking about. Like we said before, there are two different ways you can walk down a path in the woods. You can walk down that path because you've never been down that path before, and you are just astonished at what you see. Look, there's a waterfall over there. I never saw a plant like that. What weed is that? Look at that. There's a little bit of fruit growing on that branch. That's one way. The other way is a well-worn path, a path that you've been down many times in your life, and the familiarity of that path allows you to go down with just as much joy after many, many walks down that pathway as you did when you first discovered it and saw things fresh. And there's the value in the difference is this. On the first walk, you may not have kind of like a mind or the time to dwell on things like, let's say there's a guide with you and he says, that's poison ivy. Don't touch that. Or that's a wild raspberry. You can eat that. So that's all he says. You go on and you go, look at the waterfall. Look at that stump. The other way is after you've been down that path for many, many, many times, you may say, that's poison ivy, don't do that. Well, how do I tell again that it's poison ivy? Well, the leaves are a little reddish. Is there anything else? Yeah, there's 3 leaves, but there's a plant over there with 3 leaves, and that's not poison ivy. That's right, so you have to be able to tell the difference. So that's, again, what causes that is the substance. Some things can kill you, and some things can keep you alive. When we look at the Bible, we're looking at both of those things. Things that can kill you, and things that can keep you alive. And we want to know the difference. But the faith that we have, that we interact with in the knowledge of these things, is based on the substance of the things hoped for. And what we hope for is the second coming of Christ, the restoration of Israel, the establishment of the kingdom of Israel, the establishment of the throne, Christ seated on the throne of his father David, and participation in a government that will straighten this world out finally after 6,000 years of complete human misery. So this week what we're going to focus on is the ingathering that occurs when Christ sends his angels to resurrect the dead, has the judgment, and then the nations go against Jerusalem to battle. There's a series of judgments that are made, starting with the judgment of the house of God, and there are a series of ingatherings that are made. And that's what we're going to look at this morning in the context of many awake. We are still talking about the greatest or the first of those wonders in the end of Daniel, these conspicuous, miraculous events that are unlike anything that have ever occurred in history before. And this miracle of the resurrection of the dead, described in Daniel as many awake, is the first in the chronology of all those events. It's an incredibly distinct and significant event with respect to all of God's miracles in the past, because never before has there been a resurrection of sons and daughters of God to everlasting life that will comprise an army by which God will rule the nations. So that's today's subject, and it involves ingathering. One aspect of ingathering, which we're just going to stop and note before we go on to the ingathering that's most interesting or most relevant to us, is the ingathering of the remnant of Israel. Now, why does Christ need to gather the remnant of Israel at this time? It won't be before he gathers the saints from the four corners of the earth after the resurrection. This ingathering of the remnant of Israel is after that, because he causes the events that result in the need to gather the remnant back to Israel. So why does this happen? It happens because when the nations come against Jerusalem to battle, 2/3 of the city of Israel is cut off. And so we're going to talk about this at length later on in another presentation, but this is God's way of chastising Israel at the time of the coming of their Messiah, because their eyes have to be opened. God is going to use great suffering. He's going to pay them back double for their sins. It will be the third overturning of Israel, the first being Babylon, the second being Rome, the third being the Russian invasion at the time of the end. But this invasion and the nations coming against Jerusalem to battle is meant to chastise Israel and drop this particular remnant to its knees, because it will be in wrath that God remembers mercy. We've been reading about that in Isaiah, if you've done the readings this week. That wrath is his wrath against the faithless godlessness of Israel. The mercy is what he extends to Israel in spite of that, once he has chastised her. So let's look at why I say that in our own Bibles. If you don't have your Bible, start bringing it, because I think it's best if you look at it in your Bible instead of just up on screen. I'm going to put it up on screen, because you'll see it more if you look at it in your own Bible. And you'll remember it better if you look at it in your own Bible. So open your Bibles to Zechariah. And I didn't think I was going to go here, but I decided to. I think we're going to Zechariah 13, so let's try there first. I don't have this verse marked. Yeah, there it is. So I'm going to mark this in red, which in my Bible is a symbol of God's judgments, usually in a negative context. It's interesting that verse 7 and 8 describe Israel's sin 2,000 years ago. And then verse 8 speaks about God's punishment for that sin 2,000 years later, at the time of the second coming of Christ. It's fascinating, and it's all in 2 verses. And there are a lot of verses in Isaiah that do the same thing. In one verse, in 2 lines, he will talk about the first and second coming of Christ. But it says, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones." So does anybody know what this is a reference to when it says, "Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered," in verse 7? Leah.
This verse was quoted in the New Testament when Jesus was taken captive and put on trial, and all his disciples were scattered.
So he said, he spoke of his flock. He said he was the true shepherd, and they struck him. They struck him with a fatal blow, but it wasn't permanently fatal. He was only dead for 2.5 days, raised on the 3rd. So what happened after they struck the shepherd? In the big picture, what happened to Israel?
They were scattered into all nations.
That's right. God scattered them as he said he would in Deuteronomy 28. He promised, if you don't obey me, I will scatter you, and you will become a hissing and a byword, and you will find no rest for the sole of your foot. And so the term wandering Jew became a popular expression to describe what we all know is a fulfillment of God's judgments upon Israel for striking his shepherd. So they were scattered. You also know, if you've been to Sunday school, that this scattering and gathering theme has been present throughout the Bible. That he says, I scattered you, but I'm going to bring you back. And we saw that happen in 1948 as a result of World War II, when Israel was again declared to be a state. So Christadelphians were very animated in that day because they knew that it had been 2,000 years of difference between the first and second parts of that prophecy. God scattered them as a result of striking a shepherd, and he gathered them back as a result of World War II in our time. So it gives you an idea of God's time frame, but it also shows you that he is moving steadily and progressively, and I think in an accelerated manner in the big picture of thousands of years, toward the day when he will bring his son back and establish his kingdom. So he did turn his hand against his little ones, but in that context, when God thinks, I will turn my hand against my little ones, it's not just the punishment that occurred in scattering them and the trouble that they've seen in being present in the world ever since for 2 millennia, but it also involves punishing her double for her sins at the time of the coming of Christ. And this is a heartbreaking thing to realize what it's going to take to open Israel's eyes. Right now, they are blind. They are just as blind, if not more so than they were. I heard, we went down to Chrysler Hall and listened to Yitzhak Rabin, who was the guy that led the raid on Entebbe Airport back when we were all young. He's a famous guy. He was the prime minister or the president of Israel for a while, and he came and gave a lecture at Chrysler Hall. We went down to hear him. Here's what he said: no angel from heaven is going to deliver Israel. A direct affront against the prediction of the Messiah. He said if God basically took a humanist position in that lecture, and he said if God can't save us, then we must save ourselves. And that it was in the context of he was drumming up sympathy for Israel and those that would like to annihilate her. In God's mind, that disposition has to change. And the only way it's going to change is for him to purge Israel. So you have this prophecy in the 8th verse. In the whole land, declares the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive. This is going to be a horrific thing. I'm telling you, the darkest hour is just before the dawn, and it's not as dark as it's going to get at the time of the second coming of Christ. As a matter of fact, one of the prophets says, why do you long for that day? It's going to be such a bad day, a day of horror and gloom. You don't want it. You don't want to see that day, but it's going to happen. So this is a prediction of 4 million people dying again, only this time by the direct hand of the Lord, by his intervention. Christ isn't going to kill them. He's going to deliver the remnant. So that's God in wrath, remembering mercy by through the operation of his Messiah. So right at the darkest hour of Israel, 4 million of her population have been destroyed by angry, irrational, proud nations that come against her. This remnant is left alive, as it says. So, let me ask you this. If you lived in Israel and you were part of this remnant, I don't know who they are. They're probably mostly Orthodox. They're that remnant that retains some kind of faith based on the law of Moses, even though they have never acknowledged Christ. They are looking for Messiah. That remnant will be preserved, but not in Israel. So if you were in Israel and you are there at the time when these nations come against Jerusalem to battle, and 2/3 of the land of Israel are cut off, and this huge army that no one had, this unstoppable army, has come from the north and pitched his tents in the Holy Land. Again, a phrase from Daniel chapter 11. Where would you go? Which way would you run? If I was in Israel and an army came from the north, I would take one of 3 options. I would not run to the north. That's not an option. I would run west, east, or south. Right? So that's what they do. And as a matter of fact, there are prophecies that say some flee to the Isles, some flee to Assyria, which is Iraq. Some actually run to Iraq. They are so afraid. And why do they run to Iraq? Because that's far enough away to get away from all this. They can't run to Syria. They're not going to run to Jordan for some reason. They're not going to run to Saudi Arabia. They're going to go to Iraq because there's really nothing in Iraq at that time that is a threat to them. They're desperate anyway. They run into a threat rather than run into the army that has come to destroy them. And they also, I think, mostly run to Egypt. So that's where they run. And we know that because those details have been revealed to us in prophecy. All right, so let's go back to our slide. In that day, it says, the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant. That's what we were talking about. Remember, we just read about that remnant, that 1/3 that is left after the wrath of God has come upon Israel through the hand of these hostile nations. Will recover the remnant which is left of his people from Assyria, that's Iraq, from Egypt, that's in the south, from Pathros, some even get as far as Ethiopia, from Elam and Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. So that's a general description of where everybody fled at the time of this assault. And this assault is described at length in Ezekiel 38. So one part of the role of Christ is going to be to gather this remnant. So now that we've talked about this, every time you are reading in the prophets and you come across this word remnant, it's speaking about that part of Israel that is left at the time of the second coming of Christ, which will be the core group of those rescued by their Messiah, who at the time he enters into Jerusalem, they look at the wounds in his hands and they say, what are those? And he says, it's Joseph all over again. He says, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. And their eyes are opened. And it's in that moment, just like Joseph's brothers, that they recognize him. And if you think the story of Joseph, which Robert Roberts said would drop a strong man to his knees, break a strong man down, if you think that's emotional, wait till you see what happens when Israel recognizes Christ as their Messiah. There has been no more dramatic, emotional time in the history of mankind than that moment. So that's the remnant. That's the core remnant. There's another group that will be brought to Christ by the angels, and that is every Jew that remains in the world. It's a larger part of the remnant. They will be gathered from all the countries in the world to be with Christ. We'll talk about that later this summer. The Bible describes all this by the use of a metaphor. You know what the seas of the world are, the waters of the world, that when they make a noise, it sounds like people. Turbulent waters, rushing waters. They're the nations, right? The nations that include faithful but are mostly godless people. The world is filled with these waters. So that's a metaphor. One metaphor for the peoples of the world. There's another metaphor that God uses for a more selective group of people, and that's clouds. And clouds can be mentioned by God both positively and negatively, but when he does, it's a metaphor for a large group of people. So let's take a look at how three places where the Bible describes three clouds. A cloud forms in the south. This is the passage in Isaiah 19:1. The burden of Egypt. Behold, the Lord rides upon a swift cloud and shall come into Egypt. Now you remember, we were just reading about the remnant that is found in Egypt, and we know that they were kept alive by God so that they could be the core remnant of those saved by Christ at the time of his coming. So this is a description of that remnant in Egypt and why it says that he rides upon a swift cloud. In other words, this is going to happen suddenly, and he's going to come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. This is a description of Christ coming to gather the remnant. Oh, I think we skipped over this point, but you have to read these things and relate them carefully. In that day, the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant. What's that referring to? to recover the remnant, let's say, from Egypt. He's going to extend his hand yet a second time. Does anybody want to venture a guess as to when the first time God extended his hand to recover a remnant of Israel from Egypt? When was the first time? The Exodus. Way back when God had put them in Egypt to purge them, to teach them a lesson, brought them into the wilderness, then brought them back to their land. All of that was a metaphor in some respects, including judgment at Sinai, at the same mountain, for a time when Christ takes the position that Moses had and goes and gets those people who had run to Egypt and brings them back to Israel. He's going to lead them back. Why would he do this? Why would God set it up so the predominant number of Jews have gathered into Egypt, and then bring Christ to march them back to Israel? Why would he do that? I'll tell you why. Because God is going to, in several different ways, speak to Israel and the world in language that they understand. Who are these people? They are people who have held on to the law but rejected Christ. What do they believe about the law? They believe Torah is where the truth is. They're in Egypt, and Christ comes to take them to Israel. What will they remember? They will remember how Moses delivered them when they were there the first time. This second time is to open their eyes. It is used by God to give them a very strong basis of reflection for something they already believe in. That is that Moses did deliver them by God's hand, but this time by their Messiah. And who is this? This is Christ. So this second time is at the time of the second coming of Christ. So let's go back to where we were. Let's read this again. The Lord rides upon a swift cloud and shall come into Egypt. That's this Messiah that comes a second time to deliver Israel. And the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence. He's going to move them out of the way, so to speak, so that the true God can be understood. There's another place in the Bible that speaks about judgments of Christ as a bright, fiery cloud. And that's here in Ezekiel 1 and 4. We're going to go here. Open your Bible to Ezekiel chapter 1. And let's just look at this verse. In the 4th verse, now it's speaking about a great cloud which is involved with a whirlwind and fire. And that's elsewhere in this chapter referred to as wheels, but wheels is confusing because the original word there also is used to mean whirlwinds. So every time you read wheels in Ezekiel 1, from now on, think of fiery whirlwinds and God's judgments. Don't think of wheels on a chariot. And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire enfolding itself. And a brightness was about it, and out of the midst thereof as the color of amber out of the midst of fire. So far, we don't have a whole lot, just in reading this verse, we don't have a lot of basis for saying that this is a reference to the judgments of Christ as a bright and fiery cloud. It would look like that's an inference I'm making in the heading of this slide. But let's take a look at the context. All right, so he sets the time of the prophecy, and Ezekiel rather says he was among the exiles by Chebar, and he's in Babylon. And verse 4, and I looked, he begins his prophecy with this statement: a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. Now, why do we say this is the second coming of Christ? Because you remember a week or so ago, we read in Revelation that Christ, and I spoke about it at length during my talk, that Christ, his saints are characterized as having 4 faces, like creatures, but they're characterized as living creatures. Why is that? Because they're not dying creatures anymore. They used to be dying creatures, but now they have been animated into everlasting immortality, and they are truly living creatures. So he says in verse 5, and in the midst of it, this fire, this gleaming metal fire, if you think about the other metaphors we referred to, this is Christ and his saints. It's there in Daniel 7 too. In the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. So there's this fire, and in the midst of the fire, and all this is metaphorical, there are 4 living creatures. And we know those 4 living creatures are Christ and his saints. It's Lord of hosts. It's just a very cryptic, if you want to call it that, analogy of that. And this was their appearance. They had a human likeness. Why is this? Why would it say that? It says that because they used to be human. They still have, like Christ after his resurrection, they still possess a human likeness. They look like human beings, but they are not. Why would it say likeness if they're still human? It could say, but they were human. They're not human anymore. They are inhuman. They are immortal. They are now sons and daughters of the living God. They're like Christ after the resurrection. They're full of power and judgment with Christ. That's why it says they had a human likeness, because they used to be human beings, but now their likeness is more like Christ. It's also a little, I think by the prophets, it's also a little reminder that Christ used to be human. He's not a God from before the foundation of the world. He was in God's intention, yes, but he was a man like us. So in this is an inherent confirmation that our rejection of the doctrine of the Trinity, that Jesus is part of God, a triune God, is not true. It's just a little reminder. He used to be human. Each had 4 faces, with each of them 4 wings, and their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet like the soles of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. You remember Jesus is described as being like burnished bronze, but now those that are with him at his coming, that host of people of whom he is Lord, is also taking on the characteristic that is used to describe Christ, that he's bright. What's beautiful here is, it says their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and the only reference to that you can get that would tie this into everlasting saints is in Malachi 4, where he says that in the day of the rising of the Son of Righteousness, who goes forth with healing in his wings, you shall go forth as calves out of the stall. Remember, we spoke about that. They've been freed from a stall which otherwise held them in prison until they were burned up by God's judgments in a sacrifice. But these calves are free. So their legs are straight, the soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Go down a little bit further. Verse 10 describes this host of people. As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side. This is how we correlate this to Revelation chapter 4, which describes the saints around the throne in the same metaphor. They had the 4 had a face of a lion, that's the king, the merciful king. An ox, that's the humble servant. The eagle, that's the loving judge. And a man, where's the man? They had the face of a lion, an ox, and an eagle.
Just the first bit. Verse 10.
Oh, yeah, it's had a human face, the face of a man, and the man is a compassionate priest. So they have compassion, they're loving, they're humble, and they are merciful. And these are the primary characteristics of Christ and those that is at his coming. In verse 11, such were their faces. Let's just stop for a minute and say, is this in your face? When I look in the mirror, do I see this in my face? Now, that's a literal interpretation of something which is highly metaphorical. But something about our faces should show these characteristics, don't you? Because it's described as being in their faces. I think when someone's merciful, that is present in their face. When they are humble, you can see it. When they're loving, has anyone ever looked at you with a loving face? Someone that has looked at me that way. You know love when you see it in someone's face. So they go forward, and now let's go down to the end of this chapter. So they're in an expanse, and they're bringing about judgment. And they move from city to city with this whirlwind and these fiery judgments, and they judge the cities. I think this judgment starts in the immediate proximity of the nations surrounding Jerusalem, but it expands outwardly, and Ezekiel 1 probably encompasses a picture of God's judgments as they operate through Christ's kingship and extend out to the four corners of the world, city by city. This isn't when you think, what are we talking about here? You think I'm making this up? I don't think you do, because we're reading it. What are we reading this for? Because it's the substance of the things that we hope for. It's an astonishing level of substantive detail. That's what makes us know. That's our assurance that this is real. And that's why we're going into this like this. In verse 27, let's read 26 verse. And above the expanse over their heads there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of the throne was a likeness with a human appearance. And once again, it's taking it's making the effort to be detailed enough to recognize that Christ has a human appearance, because he didn't come as a spirit. You remember the test in John? He came in the flesh. And if you deny it, you're not of God. Verse 27, and upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal. Again, descriptions in Daniel 7 and Revelation 1, like the appearance of a fire enclosed all around. And again, that's a description of the saints as well. So we're talking about a multitude in Revelation 4. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around about him. And this is how we know this is Christ and the saints at the time of his coming. Because it's like the appearance of a bow. You remember what the covenant God made with Noah was? When he sees the bow in the clouds, he will remember his covenant. This will be the time when, like it was in the days of Noah, he is saving the righteous. Like the appearance of a bow that is in the cloud. And once again, this is another reference to a cloud on the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness all around the throne. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. The glory of the Lord are all those who have believed and now been elevated into immortal existence. And when I saw it, I fell on my face. And I heard the voice of one speaking. So let's just go back to this description of the bow that is in the cloud. Because this is what Noah saw. It was the image that God gave Noah to help him understand the reality of God's covenant. I'm just going to describe this for you. If he compares the peoples of this world in their ungodliness to the seas, to turbulent seas and rushing waters, and he compares the saints to a bow in the cloud, why does he do that? Why is that contrast in metaphors there for our consideration? I'll tell you what I think about that. You're welcome to think whatever you like about it, but I'll tell you what I think about it. When you look at a cloud, it's made of water just like the waters that are in the seas, right? But there's something interesting about a cloud. It's not a part of the sea. It goes up from the seas and the waterways of this world by virtue of evaporation. And then this very interesting effect takes place when all these little droplets that used to be present in the waters of the world are now in an elevated heavenly place, and they coalesce into a cloud, a thing that is visible but beautiful and illuminated by the light of the sun. They coalesce. What brings them together in this cloud of particles? It's the warming of the atmosphere, the interaction of light and sun and temperature on something that used to be a part of the waters of the world, that are now a part of the waters of heaven, but are visible as a cloud. So that's the coalescing of the saints as they rise out of the populations of the world, the waters of the world, the seas of mankind, into a heavenly place so that everybody can see them being illuminated by the light of the sun. It's just such a beautiful metaphor. But what happens the waters of the world, when they are collected together in a cloud in the sky, when they get full to the point of not being able to bear the load of their water, which in this case is righteousness, they rain down upon the earth. They get so full of people who are containing the righteousness of God that it begins to rain. And we know from scriptural descriptions that God says that he will rain his righteousness down upon the earth. Why is that? Because when this cloud of saints gets to be so full of Christ's righteousness that they rain righteousness down upon the earth, the water returns to the lands and the seas of this world, and it begins to water arid ground, and living things then begin to grow. And instead of filling the world with cities, which is what the people of the world have done, it fills the face of the world with fruit. The fruit grows as a result of the raining of righteousness. And that's why this host of people had the appearance of a bow, a covenant. The full spectrum of Christ's character and power, his overarching power in the world, that is in the cloud, this cloud of witnesses, in the day when God rains his righteousness down on the earth. So was the appearance of the brightness all around Christ's throne. Such was the appearance and the likeness of the glory of the Lord. I want to show you emphatically why we say these are the saints. Beginning at verse 1. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. What is the fullness? The fullness is that which comes from the rule of Christ when he rains his righteousness down upon the nations, and they begin to grow and are fruitful in the Lord in that day. And the world and those that dwell in. For he has founded it upon the seas. That is, he's founded his kingdom upon the nations of the world and established it upon all the tributaries that emanate from those people and those nations of every tribe, language, people, and tongue. So then he says, well, there's a hill, and the hill is in the middle of a temple. And he says, well, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? The answer is this. And this is where we do a little self-reflection, isn't it? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, does not swear deceitfully, he will receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of the Lord of Jacob, of the God of Jacob. And what's, I think, significant about the use of the term generation there is that we are in a generation which we believe is a special generation. This applies to any generation. But our generation stands out as a generation because we believe that we are of the generation or very close to the generation at the time of the second coming of Christ. That particular generation who may never see death. So he then, in this exclamation of praise, and every part of the activity of Christ that we've been speaking about, the deliverance of the remnant, the ingathering of the saints, the ingathering of Israel, the recognition of him as Messiah, his position as a military commander, just as Lord of Armies, just as much as he is the deliverer and Messiah of Israel on the throne of David. He says, lift up your heads, O gates. That's the gates of Israel. And be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. So this is an appellation that is describing Christ in his role as Messiah and King and deliverer of Israel. So he's referred to as the King of glory. And then in verse 8, there's this question. Well, who is this King of glory? In other words, why is he called a king? And what's the glory? Well, the answer to the first question is this. The Lord's strong and mighty in battle. So he's referred to as Lord of hosts because he's a king of hosts. Strong and mighty in battle. That's what makes him king. He's going to subjugate by force the nations to his will, to God's will. And he will take his throne at the point at which those nations, there's no question in anybody's mind that he is the King of glory. And then it says, lift up your heads, it repeats it, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Come in where? Come in to Jerusalem to take possession of that which he's been promised by God since the times of Abraham. Ask of me, and I will give you the inheritance, the ends of the earth for your possession. And then in verse 10, this is where the saints come in. Who is this King of glory? Well, he's strong and mighty in battle, but what is it that enables him to do that? Because he's the Lord of hosts. He's Yahweh Sabaoth. He is Lord of armies. That's what Lord of hosts is. That's all those who are with him at his coming when he delivers, when he marches to Egypt, delivers the remnant, comes to Israel, and makes himself known to the remnant of Israel in Israel. And then as he begins to rise in power, he rises in view of the nations to the point where every eye sees him. So who's that King of glory? The Lord of hosts. That's how we know when we read about these things in Ezekiel that may have eluded you by their cryptic language to this point. But hopefully you get a little bit of a better feel. That's why we know this is talking about the time, the day of rain, when righteousness is rained down from heaven from that cloud of saints who have coalesced. And let me just show you one more thing here in what we're talking about. So, and I looked, and behold, let's go back and read this again. A whirlwind, this is from Ezekiel 1:4, out of the north, a great cloud and a fire enfolding in itself, and a brightness was about it, and out of the midst thereof, as the color of amber, again a description of Christ, out of the midst of fire. Why would he be coming out of the north? Because there was an army that came from the north, and he completely destroys that army. So this is a description of what happens to Christ after the destruction of the Russian invader from the north, from the uttermost parts of the north. The king of the north had descended like a cloud. And we read this in Ezekiel 38. Thou shalt ascend and come like a storm. Thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy hordes or bands, and many people with thee. And so we've read about Christ and his cloud of witnesses. This is another. We've read about the clouds having this body of fiery saints who are immortalized and bringing about God's judgments as his hosts. And now we're reading about another cloud that covers the land, which is a horde of people from the north in Ezekiel 38. So raise your hand if you now believe that clouds are big groups of people. Okay, so that's an important point. And the reason it's an important point is in Daniel and in Matthew 24, when you read about clouds, it's not literal. When you read about us being caught together with the Lord in the air as clouds in Thessalonians 4, it's not literal clouds. It's clouds of people in the day of rain when the bow is in the cloud, when God's covenant is in his saints. That's when it is. It's that great group of people in Isaiah. This is right there in Daniel. If you've never seen it before, and you remember Matthew 24, this is it. I saw in the night visions. And behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven and came to the Ancient of Days. And they brought him near him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away. And his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Who in here, after seeing this, would think that this is just something that, well, it's nice to talk about, but I'm not sure that all that's really going to happen? Who would think that? I'm not correlating this. This is there in God's Word for anyone to read. But it takes a little bit of personal application to read it. So now just in a quick review, we've got a couple minutes left. We've spoken about the first, all of this is in the context of this two-word statement, many awake. We've been describing it for 5 weeks now. You want to talk about the substance of the things hoped for? It's all there in the mouths of his holy prophets. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall wake. Then he makes another brief statement in 2 words. Many stand. Some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they shall be, that be wise, shall shine as the brightness of the firmament. This is, just as a review, this is a consolidation of the image of God, and we're going to talk more about this next week. When Christ, who is our life, appears, we're going to be with him in glory. And that glory is that host of people who are elevated to everlasting life. It's not going to be it's not going to feel so bad anymore. All pain is going to be gone then. Nothing but power. Full control. Together they are the mighty ones of God. That's Yahweh Elohim. God is manifested in mighty ones gathered from their awaking into a great cloud of witnesses when the Son of Righteousness arises with healing in his wings. In his rising, they are seen as the world, as Yahweh Elohim, which means in the image of God. Those mighty ones who are now in the image of God. So just a summary of what we've been speaking about in the first wonder. Thousands stand before him. That's the resurrection. The judgment was set. The books are open. The Son of Man comes with clouds. He's given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. So now we can go to the next miracle, miracle 2, next week.